today I'm really happy to welcome Professor Carozza to speak to you. So you've all seen the marketing materials in the bio. I don't like to read full bios because it takes up time or we could be talking. But very briefly, Professor Paolo Carozza, he's professor of law and concurrent professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. More scholarship than I'm going to read out here, but a lot of really fascinating work on comparative constitutional law, human rights law, and a lot on tech and the impact of AI on human dignity and on the rule of law. So, very relevant to our work at the Good Counselor Project, which is very concerned with the humanity of the formation of lawyers, but I think all the more relevant because of the encyclical that just came out of Rome last week. So that is going to be the topic of our conversation. And before we get started, just one thing is Professor Carozza is very open to taking questions. I think a lot of people probably have questions, maybe more than normal, given how much attention this encyclical has gotten. And we have a real expert on this field who has done a lot of media on the encyclical in the last week and a half. So please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A function here, and you can do them in real time. Do them while the initial remarks are going on, because I have questions. I can make this a fireside chat, but I would much rather hear from you who are listening. So the more questions you have, the fewer of my own questions I will use. So feel free to start asking questions as soon as you have them. And with that, I will turn it over to you. Professor Carozza, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Frank. I'm really looking forward to this, and I really admire what you're trying to do with the Good Counselor Project. It's so important. So welcome to everybody. Frank and I were talking about other topics that I might be speaking about today, and it was only really as the encyclical came out or was about to come out that we decided to pivot towards this one instead, precisely in the recognition that it would be something that touches so many of us in so many ways, our professional lives, but also our family lives and personal lives and the society around us. I'm going to try to keep my initial remarks pretty brief so that we can have things more in the form of a conversation and a back and forth, which I think is going to be more helpful. And I'll keep it relatively informal. But essentially, what I'm going to start with is just a quick overview of what I think are some of the main themes and takeaways of it and ways of reading, a key to reading the document in a few ways, and then highlighting a few of the ways in which it might connect more specifically to our distinctive roles as lawyers, as professionals, as lay people in the world. So, as we all know, this document echoes Rerum Novarum, the origins of at least modern formalized Catholic social teaching, now referred to in this document very deliberately as Catholic social doctrine. And that was responding to the Industrial Revolution and the transformations in the late 19th century by Pope Leo XIII. This Pope takes his name directly echoing that, and intentionally because of the time that Leo XIII was responding to. I think it's interesting that the title of the original encyclical that kicks this process off, Rerum Novarum, usually is translated as new things, and literally from Latin, that is how it translates. But that some people translate it in context as referring really to the revolutions of the time, not just the new things, but the radical transformations going on at the end of the 19th century. And I only say that because I think we can all recognize that it's true here too for us. This is not just a new kind of technology, but it's a new kind of technology and technological permeating of society that has impacts that are unbelievably broad. Raises a host of moral and social concerns, from impacts on labor to the problems of the education and development of children and addiction to our politics and even our personal relations. And all of these things, as you've read the document, you can see Pope Leo touches on in passing in various ways. And a lot of those have gotten attention in the news and so forth, this issue or that issue. But I think it's really important not to lose the forest for the trees here, right? What is really interesting and distinct and important about Magnifica Humanitas is not what it says about one or another of these issues. Any one of those could be interesting, and we can happy to talk about them in question and answer. But what's much more important about it is to try and see the ways in which it provides a unifying framework for thinking about all of these collectively. Right. And that's what's unique about it, because we have lots of policy debates and moral interventions and blog posts and academic work and going on specific issues. But what links them all together has really been sort of a fragmented incoherence of discussion on a global stage. And that's what he's trying to fill. Right. And he's trying to fill it, first of all, in a way that emphasizes that technology is not in itself either something that's inherently evil here, or something that's the solution to the problems of humanity, but that everything depends on how it's used. And what's key to the document is he's emphasizing that we need to be able to use technology personally and collectively in ways that allow us to remain human. And to do that, it's a tool, as he calls it, a valuable tool that requires vigilance. That really summarizes a lot of the approach. He says technology is never neutral. It takes on the characteristics of those who devise, finance, and regulate it. But because of that, the choice, and I'm quoting him here, is not between a yes or a no to that technology, right? But it is one of either using the analogies that then permeate the rest of the document, constructing Babel or rebuilding Jerusalem, between a power that claims to dominate the heavens and the people, and a people who work together in the presence of God to rebuild the walls of fraternal coexistence. So the danger that he's pointing out in all of these sub areas is that the human being becomes subordinate to the technology. We become an instrument of the technology rather than the technology an instrument of the common good and human beings. And that means essentially that what is at the heart of the encyclical, to view it from a different angle, is the problem of power. Power features very strongly as a theme throughout this document. And very interestingly, he quotes the well-known 20th century philosopher and theologian Romano Guardini. Notwithstanding the Italian name, he was a German, and thought a lot about power and technology in the middle of the 20th century. He was the one who said, that's not quoted in this document, but elsewhere, he said, the problem that we are going to face is not the problem of power itself, but whether we can exercise power in such a way that allows us to remain human. And he said that all the way back in 1951, anticipating what was going to be coming. So very prophetic. And Leo picks up on that here to say the problem isn't power, but as such, but the problem is our moral development, our moral maturation, so that we learn how to use power in a way that serves human beings well, serves the common good well. And that maturation has to be both a personal one and a communal one, that our moral growth matches our growth in power through these technologies. And so he concludes sort of the introduction by saying, the crucial questions that impose themselves on our conscience and can no longer be avoided are these. Where are we going? Toward what goal do we wish to orient ourselves? What direction should we choose as a people and as a human community? And rather than simply sort of provide answers to that, the other major theme is that this is a process in which we need to cooperate. We need to work together to discern the path well for the future. So it's not so much providing a roadmap as providing an exhortation to work together in order to discern, and providing principles of discernment. He calls it very specifically a shared discernment process for identifying the spiritual and cultural roots of ongoing transformations, right? Note the spiritual and cultural roots, not the politics, policy, law, regulation, etc. Not in the first instance, although those will follow. But the spiritual and cultural roots is what we're talking about. And for that discernment, he relies on the core principles of Catholic social doctrine, which I'm not going to describe in detail in the interest of time, but he goes through all of them in what is really sort of an interesting reconstruction, both historically and conceptually, of the sort of broad outline of Catholic social doctrine as a whole. Human dignity, of course, is at the core of all of it, the starting point for all of Catholic social doctrine. He makes that clear. And then from there, the common good, which is the social dimension of the recognition of human dignity, subsidiarity, so the distribution of responsibility within society, appropriately at all levels, the universal destination of goods, which is a particularly, I guess, provocative call in the context of new forms of property that we're talking about in the context of today's technology. The principle of solidarity, which essentially talks about turning what is a de facto imposed interdependence functionally into something that becomes a virtue, a form of love by being the willed good of other people. And finally rounds that out with the idea of integral human development. In other words, the development of the whole person and of every person. And again, I think that's really key, the whole person and every person in the context of the technologies we're talking about, because of the way that that AI, as we all see, affects not just all aspects of society, but really affects the human person in a very direct and deep way, in a way that other kinds of technologies in the past have not done, or have done so only much more indirectly. So, from that discernment, those criteria of discernment, he then comes back to his metaphor of building the walls of Jerusalem together, recalling one of the stories, the story of Nehemiah from the Hebrew Scriptures, and emphasizes that that's a question of shared responsibility, as I said. So just to quote one key passage of his, he says, no one can single-handedly bear the weight of the challenges the world is facing, just as no one is so weak that they cannot play their part, for power is made perfect in weakness, quoting Corinthians. All are given their own section of the wall: scientists and researchers, entrepreneurs and workers, educators and legislators, civil society, popular movements, faith communities. I dare say lawyers are in that list too, right? This is the logic of subsidiarity, he says, which values the cooperation between generations, peoples, disciplines, and cultures as the best way forward. We should not be intimidated by tensions or differences in this, because they can become creative forces when guided. So how does that translate now into the particular sort of role that we would play as legal, lay, Christian professionals? Okay? The first thing I think to underscore is his emphasis and recognition of the distinctive way in which Catholic social doctrine depends on the role of the laity in the life of the church and in the world, and the distinct competences and responsibilities that we have from the hierarchy of the church, in a way that's different from many other doctrinal or theological areas of reflection. The purpose of Catholic social doctrine is to provide fundamental principles, right? But to do so in a way that learns from the practical experience of the world, of humanity in history, from earthly realities that we live in our communities, and as well as to contribute to them. So he recognizes the autonomy of earthly realities and the distinction between ecclesiastical and political spheres of competence. Those are his words. And so he emphasizes the church isn't here to offer what he calls a definitive opinion on these things, but rather to listen to research, experience, to the expertise of those who are living in the world from a position of faith, and from that patrimony to incorporate a particular vision of how to go forward, but also to help guide it with the principles and norms of Catholic social thought. So you can really see how critical it is for a well-formed, educated, lay Christian faithful to be in the world trying to discern the path forward together for us. And law is a critical part of that progress of discernment, and a part of what I referred to earlier as the moral progress. He makes that very clear. Law properly ordered to the human person as its goal. In fact, he refers to a variety of historic moments in the development of law, especially at a global scale, things like the Geneva Conventions, for example, as examples of where a well-formed law is illustrative of the moral progress that mankind can make when cooperating together. But he emphasizes along the way that, again, we're talking first about spiritual and cultural transformation prior to the problem of law and regulation in a formal sense. And the other thing he emphasizes is that for law to exercise that kind of function, to serve as an instrument of moral progress and of order and of direction to the common good, there has to be a strong connection between law and truth, and in particular between law and the truth of the human person. As he puts it, what is law without the conviction, born of age-old reflection and great wisdom, that each human being is sacred and inviolable? And the answer to that is law becomes simply an instrument of power rather than an instrument of service to the common good in that case. So he concludes, because of all of those things, with this extremely strong call for personal responsibility. He says, let us not be afraid to get our hands dirty on the construction site of our time. Let us pray, plan wisely, work perseveringly, placing God at the forefront of our actions and the human person at the center of our choices. And he refers to this very specifically as a vocational task, using the word vocation. Our vocation is not to be passive spectators of social and cultural fractures, he said, nor mere commentators on what is crumbling, but men and women prepared to enter the construction sites of history, research laboratories, technology companies, schools, the media, institutions, local communities, our law firms, our places, our communities where we live would be included in that list, in order to rebuild what has collapsed and protect what is threatened. So because of that, we have to be able to engage, not just get our hands dirty in the social level, but really reflect on our own personal relationship with this responsibility and with the technology that is at the heart of it. The construction site of our time requires, as he puts it, cultivating hearts that love truth, prefer what is right, pursue wisdom, cultivate relationships. And that we can all do our part. I can't resist here the observation that in exhorting us all to do our part, he even goes so far as to quote Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. So, for the first time, making Tolkien part of a canonical magisterial teaching, as far as I know, which warms my heart, maybe many of yours as well. He also emphasizes, two other things I think that are key, and I'll close with this. One is that we need to both be and to see and to follow credible witnesses in the world. That is essential to Christian construction of the space of the common good. And he points out an extraordinary, beautiful, long list of witnesses that includes saints and martyrs, but also many people who simply have exercised a strong forms of moral leadership in our communities from a Christian inspiration. And secondly, that he points out that Christian hope is needed more than ever. That's grounded really in the vision and understanding that it's only in Christ that we understand fully the meaning of our own humanity. He emphasizes beautifully at the end of the document an incarnational theology and the need for an incarnational theology in a world that is digital and virtual and mediated. Because what saves humanity is this divine love that doesn't just exist in an abstract, but that descends into the most fragile point of our history and renews it from within, as he puts it. So I'll stop there. Love to have any questions that you want to raise, Frank, as well as ones that our other participants might want to talk about as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That's a great way to start. So I have lots of substantive questions, but I want to start with one that came through the Q&A, and I think it's a good situating question, especially for non-Catholics. I know there's at least one in attendance here. So this attendee asks, for the non-Catholics, can you help me understand, what kind of a document this is? It's much longer than I expected, just taking a glance at it. Who's the audience, and can you explain kind of what happens as a result of issuing a document like this? Is it read in all the masses? Is it like what happens once a document like this is promulgated?
Yeah, it's a great and important question. And sorry, I'm just trying to fix my computer here, which of course is choosing this moment to tell me I need to update it. Um, our relationship with tech, right, is always at the heart of things. This document, so it's uh, traditionally encyclicals were addressed primarily to bishops, and they were addressed to bishops with the intention of there being documents through which the bishops would teach in their diocese, and then pass down through all others who exercise and participate in the teaching functions of the church. Um, Starting about 75 years ago, many encyclicals began to be addressed more broadly, not only to the lay people in the church, but even to people of all goodwill. This document doesn't explicitly say who it's addressed to, but it seems clear from the way that from the tone and from many of the things that it says, that the latter is true. It's being addressed to all people of goodwill in the world. At the same time, however, there's no question that long parts of the document, I would say, especially the first 30 or 40 pages of it, seem very distinctly oriented towards talking to the Catholic faithful, right? It's this historical reconstruction of the arc of Catholic doctrine on certain things. So it's a little bit of a mishmash of things in terms of addressees. But when he gets to the question of, the problem of technology, the problem of power, the social problems that are generated, he's trying his best, and I think he's quite successful in pointing out things that are and should be of interest to anyone who takes his or her own humanity and community seriously, right? Because these are questions that affect all of us. Now, how would it have an impact from here? What would be sort of the trajectory of the way that it's used? And this is an important point, because I think a lot of the public commentary that you come across um, tries to evaluate and assess the document as if it is like a white paper policy intervention today telling people what to do. Okay. And it's just not that. That's not the way that it's structured. That's not the intention of it. It is meant as a teaching document. It's a document that is meant to have an effect insofar as it is reflected on, not through a hot take, not through a meme or a blog post, but through the processes of reflection, discernment, education, discussion, the way that it might make its way into parish discussion groups and into professional settings, and the way that each of us might read it and reflect on our personal responsibility and so forth. So it's something that is written for the longue durée, and that's important to understand, right? That gives it a certain kind of tone that says, look, the main things I'm setting out here are the things that I think should continue to be relevant a century from now, not just tomorrow.
Great. That's a good segue, because you pointed out that one of the ways that this document should be handled is that it should trickle down and be part of a conversation, especially among various professions and crafts. And so I want to focus on the legal profession for a minute, because that's who we're talking to, and that's what the GCP program does. So I pre-asked one of our listeners for a question here that I really like. So the legal profession, I think, particularly today, can be viewed, and often views itself, as kind of a technocratic problem-solving machine. And so with AI in particular, this can exacerbate that, right? AI is kind of poised to make a lot of the technical roles filled by especially early career attorneys, law clerks, paralegals, potentially largely obsolete. That's why part of the reason the Good Counselor Project Fellowship exists, and I think is so important, to help to humanize the work of the lawyer and emphasize the role of the lawyer as a human counselor and not merely a technocrat that speaks legalese, right? So I wonder if you could maybe comment on the particular challenges of AI and these potential affronts to dignity and work from this emerging technology, specifically for the practice of law.
Yes, absolutely. It's such an important question for all of us. I look at my students every year, and every year I'm more worried about how that's going to play out for them. Um, so I guess though I'd start by saying, in a certain sense, but I'm going to qualify this in a moment. In a certain sense, let's remember that it is a technology and a tool in a discipline in which technology and tools have transformed the way that we work already in many ways at different points in history. whether it was the printing press, which radically transformed the nature of law and the practice of law, to the creation of court reporters, to much more recently the creation of legal databases. I mean, when I went to school, law school, Westlaw was only just becoming to be online, and the professors that I had were deeply worried that it would radically stunt our capacity to know how to do research and to find law. Okay. Um, to some extent, AI can fall into that category as well. It's a tool to do research in a way that is faster, more effective, to go through documents at thousands of pages at a time in just a few hours or minutes, and so forth. And I think a lot of people see that and welcome it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is if you stop there, right, and say, okay, it's just a tool for efficiency, so why are we worried about it? And I think the main thing to distinguish is that the technologies that we loosely lump together under the label of AI here are distinctive in the way that they co-opt and integrate the very processes of our own judgment, discernment, analysis, critical engagement, understanding into the technology, right? Um, that's what makes them uniquely powerful. That's what makes them uniquely, dangerous and precarious for us as well. And so I think that the most important thing to sort of think about and identify is that we can't be using these without a very sustained and deep process of self-reflection about how do I use that technology and what is it, not simply what does it do for me in terms of getting through documents or doing research, but what is it doing to me when I use it, right? How does it change my own processes of thinking, of reasoning, and so forth? I'll just close with a quick example of how I think we can begin to get at this question. This last semester, for the first time, I changed completely the way that I taught my seminar on law and technology. And I had my students take up a scholarly paper every week, usually with a guest scholar in, and they had to, analyze and comment on this paper and provide some sort of reflection on it. But this time what I did is I had them first engage in a reflection without the use of technology. They had to critically analyze the paper entirely on their own without using AI. And then they had to take the next step and upload the paper into whatever their favorite tool was, right? Anthropic, Gemini, et cetera, and use the AI tool as a way of analyzing the arguments and and thinking about sort of critically where its strengths and weaknesses and contributions are, and then engage and write for me a reflection on the difference between those two and how the technology affected or changed, depending on their use of it, their own rational capacities. In what way did it seem like an important extension of their reach? In what ways was it actually displacing or sort of insinuating itself into their process of reasoning and directing it in ways that they might not have been as conscious of or as aware of when they first started using it? I think that's the kind of exercise. I think it served my students very well, and I learned a lot from watching them do this. And I think that's what we all need to do as we begin to use these technologies in our professional life.
Yeah, I think that's a very wise distinction between when it's extending our powers versus displacing them. And I think the concern for a lot of people, we've talked about this a lot with various lawyers I know, the issue I see is that if it can displace people, which it can, I've heard lawyers who are partners at firms saying, well, I can plug a question in and get a memo or get an answer that's as good as what a second or third year associate can do. So there will always be need for us in the upper echelons, right? The partners to make the human judgments, but it can do what a lot of the more junior associates can do. And I think the immediate concern is, well, how do you form the people who will be those senior lawyers if they don't go through the grind of being junior associates and doing this analysis? There seems to be a gap that could be a real problem. Do you have any thoughts on how that might play out in the profession?
Yeah, no, that's precisely the right way of framing it, I think, Frank. And I think a lot of people have made that observation that, you know, in the past where, just to take some random numbers, if in the past sort of 80% of the work of a large law firm or a big accounting firm or comparable kinds of professional organizations would have been essentially gathering and systematizing data, whether that data is legal precedents or spreadsheets, and 20% would have been actually like analyzing it, working with it, making judgments about what direction it points to and how to and what conclusions to draw from it. That that now those percentages have to be reversed, right? Given the technology, only 20%, and again, the numbers are random, it's just for illustrative purposes, of our time and energy collectively will be going towards the gathering and organizing of the data, and 80% needs to go rather, and if we do that successfully, it could be exponentially beneficial for the capacity of humans to use information in a way that is more constructive and contributing to beneficial outcomes, right? But the key is, where do you learn to make those judgments? Where do you learn to use the data in a way that is in fact, serving a common purpose? And the risk is that by datafying and quantifying everything, including in particular ourselves, right? And that's the Pope's admonition, that we end up using our technical skills not in the service of humanity, but in the service of values of that are much more reductive, values of efficiency, for example, in particular, and utility in a very crude sense. And if that happens, then the people who are going to suffer the most are the people who are the weakest, right? The most vulnerable persons of society. So we do need to guard against that. What is the answer is exactly new forms of education, I think. And I don't mean that just in the narrow sense of schools and institutions, but education as formation, as the increase of our capacity to maintain sight of what is distinctively valuable about human beings, and how do we protect that, and therefore how do we direct technologies not merely towards efficiency, but efficiencies only as an intermediate step towards the common good.
Yeah. All right, I have a couple of questions. One that I articulated, I'm going to use it to frame, I think, and maybe combine a couple of the questions in the chat here. So, one of the things that I was reflecting on and thinking about this encyclical is looking back to Rerum Novarum and the focus that Leo XIII has on the importance and the role of private property for freedom and human flourishing. And I think that becomes very fraught. And I think one of the things people have said is maybe a little bit outdated in Rerum Novarum because it's focused on, if you can hold enough land to grow food and to have a plot that's your own, you can be a little bit more independent, able to flourish and what have you. But physical land is not necessarily the most productive means of capital, of self-sustaining and all of that. So I think we're kind of in a different world, especially when so much of, I think, the money that's going to be generated in the coming age is going to be through AI and the holding of information and computing power. So one of the questions in the feed here, it's related. He says in paragraph 95 of the encyclical, the Pope notes that in the digital context, control over platforms, infrastructure, data, computing power often rests with major economic and technological actors rather than the state. And this concentration of power can become opaque and lead to new dependencies, manipulations, inequalities, and so on. But the question he asks is this critique of the technocratic paradigm directed, is this primarily at private transnational corporations? And couldn't you maybe aim the same criticism at technocratic governance within
Oh,
states as well?
yes, absolutely. And I don't see any reason to think, and no reason to read this document as something that is critiquing companies rather than in distinction to the critique of states. So when he's talking about the technocratic paradigm, he is every bit talking about the way that states are governed, as well as he's talking about power. Now, the reason to single out companies is that for the first time in human history, well, maybe not for the first time, but to an extent beyond anything previously present in human history, companies are the locus of these new forms of power in ways that states simply can't keep up with. I have been working the last 4 years as a member of a body called the Oversight Board, which helps to make difficult, independent decisions and policy recommendations on content moderation problems on Meta's platforms. The reason that I agreed to do that is because of the necessity that I see of trying to hold a company like Meta accountable and responsible to the common good, in recognition of the fact that literally and without question, it's not even close. Meta is the most powerful regulator of human speech ever to exist in human history, right? And that's just one example. The AI companies now, the frontier AI companies, are exercising that power in all sorts of other ways. So the real problem is power. The problem is not public versus private. And going back to the question of private property in that, that's probably partly, Frank, why I highlighted in my opening remarks that principle of the universal destination of goods is a very provocative one in this context. And I think so it bears reminding ourselves that from the point of view of Catholic teaching and the moral and philosophical tradition, going back to the patristic era, at least, and indeed, in a certain sense, even to the Acts of the Apostles, is that on the one hand, private property is an important and good institution to serve the common good. It would be wrong to deny the right to private property. It would be a fundamental harm to subsidiarity, to freedom, and to the common good. But why? Because functionally, allowing people to have private property serves the common good, not just my personal good. And so it's a right that has to be understood as having not just an individual dimension, but a collective and interpersonal and relational dimension as well. And so there's always an implicit limitation on our private property, that it not be used in ways that are contrary to the common good as well. And now that we're talking about the importance of these new forms of property that you were listing out of the document, Frank, computing power, data, rather than simply a plot of land, that same principle has to apply to these areas. It's simply, if it is justifiable for a company, for example, to exercise proprietary rights over certain kind of computing and data, it is only because that kind of private control over that property also serves the larger common good and must not be used against it or to undermine it or to enslave people, frankly, metaphorically or literally.
Yeah. There's a question came through that I think follows up on this. So somebody asked, do you see a parallel between the problem of digital power being in very few private hands and subsidiarity as an answer that maybe on the one hand allows for social accountability, but also calls for Christians taking a stronger stand in personal domestic decisions regarding work, education, and so on? And the follow-up is, can you think of specific practical ways in which we, particularly as lawyers, can contribute to the common good in this landscape?
Yeah. So on the first question, there's no question there's a tension. I think that's exactly the tension that the Pope is trying to bring out deliberately in calling for subsidiarity while at the same time identifying the concentration of power. And it's not, it is in particular, again, to emphasize the nature of the technology as not being a neutral one, right? In a way that is different from many other technologies, even the technology of like whatever, the assembly line in the 19th century. And the reason it's not neutral is because it's technology precisely that is based on the organization, interpretation, and deployment of human knowledge. And therefore, at every step, it is infused with value decisions, inevitably, inescapably. And so the question of how the organization how the information is organized and then how it's distributed, how it's gathered, how the models are tuned, how they're trained, what kind of guardrails are put in place. All of those necessarily and inescapably affects are infused with a variety of certain value choices about how society should be ordered, about how to judge the truth of things. And that in particular is where the Pope is calling for subsidiarity to come into play, right? So practically speaking, how can that come out? It's an extraordinarily difficult problem, and I don't have the answer. He doesn't pretend to have the answer. Um, but I think that's part of the reason why you saw, kind of controversially, a representative from Anthropic sitting on the stage when the encyclical was presented formally in Rome. The idea is we have to have a genuine dialogue across all of these lines. And the more that there are divisions between, the industry and society, between engineers and lawyers and humanists, et cetera, or between countries across borders and languages and peoples, the more unlikely it is that we can actually put subsidiarity to work by having all people in different forms contribute to the construction of the wall. In other words, to be the input into what the models, how they're designed, how they're deployed, what they're used for, and what their impact is going to be. So I would say, coming to the last part of the question, very specifically what we do as lawyers, um, there's actually a lot, even if much of it might seem to be planting seeds in a vast field that might only have the hope of germinating a long time in the future. It begins, as I said, with our own personal relationship with the technology. That don't underestimate how much that matters, and then how much that bleeds into what is our relationship to our friends and our professional colleagues. How does technology fit into that, and AI? How are we educating our own children and in our families and our homes? That's not different from what it means to be a lawyer in the professional context. And those are deeply intertwined, right? But then at a social level, it means encouraging a politics. We can't do this without politics in the best classical sense of communal organization around what are the most important values to govern our society together, and not just politics as a clash of power and a clash of interess. So fostering a politics that encourages a robust discussion at every level, from the most local to the national and international ones, of what are the values that should guide us, are the responsibilities that we distinctively have as lawyers, because lawyers have a special kind of access to and privileged way of engaging political discourse and political life, especially in the United States, which is a country made of lawyers and on the law and on the rule of law. So all of those things are ways in which we have not just an opportunity, but a deep responsibility.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind on that note is, in Rerum Novarum, Leo the 13th gives a bunch of practical, policy guidance about, everything from child labor to unions. But ultimately, he has this beautiful section where he talks about, at the end of the day, the wealthy, right, the capitalists, if you use the term, have a duty, right, to the workers, to the poor, to use their wealth and to use their power for the common good. And that's hard to legislate, but important for Catholics especially to keep in mind. So I wonder if how that plays out in the digital age for lawyers too is um, good, virtuous Catholics are going to make the decisions to hire and mentor young lawyers, even if it's going to hurt the bottom line of how much they take home. These are hard questions, but if you want real practical advice, that seems to be part of it. Like, how do we maybe react to AI in ways that are not going to be the most profitable, but going to be really important for the future of humanity?
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing I would add, which I should have said it earlier, is so much of what is needed is the formation of good law here. We're in a vacuum, especially in the United States, right? In other countries, there are plenty of laws, and they're not necessarily very good laws. In the United States, at least for the time being, it's more a question of the absence of adequate regulation. And when you raise that question, including when the Pope raised that question, so often what we hear in response, especially from the technologists, is, "Oh my gosh, absolutely, don't go there because that'll limit innovation. And the last thing we can do right now is limit innovation, or we'll lose the arms race with China." And believe me, I have no interest in seeing the Chinese Communist Party becoming the monopolistic possessor of the most cutting edge technologies in here. That would not be in the interest of humanity as a whole. At the same time, though, it is much too simplistic, and we ought to be the voices of pointing out that it's much too simplistic to say any kind of law, any kind of regulation is necessarily contrary to human creativity and to the advancement of the human genius in this case. That's simply not true. It is true that it matters that law is oriented well towards the proper human values in doing so. And that's what our job is to point that out. And not our job simply as lawyers, as technicians, but as lawyers who are formed in the wisdom of millennia of the Western legal tradition.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question in the chat that relates to the AI race I wanted to cover here. So somebody asked, when it comes to policy debates, the encyclical offers many lessons against the AI race between the US and China in particular, as you referenced. However, one could also argue for the importance of placing these technological tools in the hands of those who can be regarded as more responsive or more accountable, and hence for the need to develop these technologies in democratic societies rather than authoritarian states. Could you read parts of the encyclical to maybe support the need for democratic nations to quote unquote win the AI race, which I think you kind of mentioned too, that I hesitate there because the freer states maybe don't have regulations sufficient to chain
Yeah,
the private organizations in these freer countries. But anyway, do you have any thoughts
yeah,
on
yeah,
that?
yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I'm glad the question was raised and that you put it forward in those terms. And because there are two points I'd like to make in relation to that. One, stepping back just a tiny bit from it, I do think it is interesting that in talking about democracy and the value of democracy, this Pope has been much more explicit and positive in this document than probably any of his predecessors. John Paul II, St. John Paul II, started that process in a very robust way of sort of, praising the importance and value of democratic life. But I think here I can't help but see between the lines that Pope Leo this is where you can see that he's an American Pope and appreciates has a certain kind of appreciation for the value of democracy. So the first part of the answer is yes, absolutely, it does matter that free, democratic, rule of law abiding societies are the ones in which this technology is developed and governed. Principally, I don't want to underestimate that extent. At the same time, though, that only remains true if democracy remains oriented towards certain fundamental moral principles. And that is also what the Pope says. Democracy can't be understood merely as a form of majoritarianism. Or if it is understood as that, then it's only an instrument that then also needs to be guided morally by other principles. So if we were to become, I'm not trying to make any sort of judgments about where we are as a democracy, that's a separate seminar we need to have at a different time, okay? But if we were to become a society that is democratic only in institutional form and in majoritarianism, and is not at the same time governed deeply culturally, spiritually by fundamentally humanistic values, then that advantage of having the technology located in, developed in, and governed by democratic societies is lost. So the question itself presupposes not simply that we are a free democratic society, but that we're a free democratic society that remains deeply rooted in civilizational values of human dignity and of the common good. If that's true, then the answer to the question is a resounding yes.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Thank you. I want to switch gears a little bit because there's a topic that we talked about beforehand a little that I want to make sure we get to. And I remember reading, I don't know, a couple months ago, I think it was the head of Anthropic had called together a group of ethicists and philosophers to talk about, he wanted to make sure that the AI the LLM had like an ethical code built into it. And he was kind of peppered with questions about, well, what kind of ethical code? Are we talking like Aristotelian ethics? Are we talking, what kind of ethical? And he seemed completely baffled by the question, and it was kind of a reversion to, well, it just needs to be ethical. But that raises, I think, a big question about the difference between Christian humanism, transcendence, and Christian ways of looking at AI and technology and the ethical use, and the kind of, I think you said Silicon Valley style transhumanism, posthumanism. How do we deal with this dynamic? Because the latter group is clearly in control of the development of this technology.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that uh, so the Pope draws a really interesting and important distinction. And it's only in a few paragraphs, but they're very choice and pointed paragraphs of criticism at the what I'll just shorthand call the transhumanist kind of view that uh, that humanity essentially can be superseded by the technology or can be overcome. And at the core of that question is the question of human limits. I think what some of the most beautiful parts of this encyclical that bear much rereading and reflection is on the way in which human limitation and vulnerability is exactly part of what it means to be created in the image of God and dignified, right? Because it creates in us an orientation of dependence on God. And so our fulfillment is intimately related with our human limitations, including even the question of suffering, which Christ reveals to us on the cross, right? How much suffering is a part of what it means to grow in our humanity, and to relate to others with dignity and so forth. It's not something simply to be set aside or overcome. And so much of the technological project that we're looking at today is one essentially of trying to overcome every human limitation, every human weakness, every human dependence. And that's what he's seeing as the transhumanist project. Okay. Um, but I think the best part of the response is not simply that he says limitations are part of dignity and not contrary to human dignity, right? Which think of how countercultural that is in the discussions over whatever, euthanasia, for example, in particular. You see that. But that he also goes on to say, let's remember that the transcending of our human limitations is, in fact, in a different way, an essential part of the Christian vision of reality. What we are called to as Christians is to transcend our human limitation, but not through our own efforts, not through a form of Pelagianism or technocracy, but rather through a form of dependence by the God who himself takes human form in order for the human to become part of the divine. And so the desire for transcendence, the desire to be post or transhuman in a very different meaning of that word, is inscribed in us in our very creation. I think that's such an important answer, not simply because in its own right, but because of the form that the answer takes. He's looking at the desires that are animating so much of the technological project and saying, look, let's try to recognize the way that those desires do reflect certain fundamental elemental human needs and orientations and redirect them. And I think that's such an important lesson because it gives us a key to the approach to technology as a whole, right? Not to say, well, that's anti-human, and so I'm just going to, try to sort of oppose it and resist it with all my might. But rather, the Christian project that he's proposing to us is one that goes deeper than they go themselves into the humanity that underlies their own desires and recaptures them and says, we know how better to fulfill those. Right?
Yeah. So I guess the follow-up is, are you hopeful that when this technology is being created and developed at warp speed largely by people with that kind of transhumanist mentality, that we can find a way to humanize this as it becomes a huge part of our society?
Well, I'll be totally honest. It kind of depends on what day you find me,
Yeah.
and that's probably true of all of us to some extent. I don't see how anyone who's paying attention can't be deeply, deeply worried about what we're seeing, and truly alarmed by the direction that so much of the society and the world and our sort of personal relations and existence are going. But um, but at the end of the day, I mean, and, when I'm really sort of thinking about it in a as sort of sober and comprehensive a way, as Pope Leo is encouraging us to do here, yes, I'm hopeful. I don't think I could be hopeful about it without a Christian faith. I'll be very honest. At least personally, I know I wouldn't be able to be, because it seems so clear to me that the powers that are being unleashed are powers that are beyond the powers of human control. And so, without a recognition and a dependence on something greater than us, but something greater than us that has already intervened in history,
Yeah.
I would consider that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my wife was born in Montana. I'd probably be going back to her hometown and joining a survivalist community or something like that. But that fact that there has been this, and again, this is why I pointed out how much Leo emphasizes the incarnation as ultimately the right answer here. That intervention of the divine, of the eternal, of the infinite, of our destiny into human history in time means that he's with us. And that's the power that is infinitely greater even than the powers that are being unleashed by this technology. And that's what gives me hope.
That's great. I think we could probably go another hour. At least I certainly could. But I know we're coming up on time. So, final question, which relates to what you just said. You referenced at one point in the encyclical in your opening remarks the need to not just, stand by and watch things crumble and comment from that perspective, but to rebuild. And that's obviously necessary as long as this world keeps going and we live in it. So, I guess my practical question is, take away the transhumanist Silicon Valley types. Even within the Christian world, there are tech optimists who are very, bullish about what we can do with this and the world that we could develop and cultivate with this technology. And then you have on the other end like the doomer tech pessimists who are like this is the end of humanity. So I guess if you were to give like one caution or one parting thought to maybe each group, how would you address each of those extremes?
So it's a hard question without thinking about it in advance, right? But I'll do my best in one final minute here. To the tech optimists, I would ask them to just to reflect on their own limits. What would they when would they put aside their technology? What do they experience without technology? Can they experience life without technology? Right. Recently I took a backpacking trip in the Grand Canyon with my wife and our youngest daughter, and I used AI all sorts of ways in order to help plan that trip. And but what was the most beautiful part of that trip is then we crossed the rim and started going down, and the technology was gone and it was
Yeah.
off. And so to experience my humanity in a way without technology, can they do that? And under what circumstances? Tell me how.
Yeah.
Right. And to the doomers, I would say this: uh, are you really willing to deny that technology is and always has been part of human genius and human creativity? It has always been the case in human history that technology of every form is exactly part of how we participate in the creative image of God that has been placed in our hearts. And if that's true, then that has to be true here in some way, even if that way is hard to see and hard to identify. But that means we have to look for it. And if you're panning for gold in a river, you have to put your hands in a lot of mud over a lot of time in order to find the nugget of gold. That's what we need to do with the technology today.
Well, for an unprepared last answer, that was a great way to close. With that, Professor Carozza, thank you so much for being here with us. This was a really incredible conversation, and thank you to everybody for participating and for being here.
Thank you, Frank. It was a real pleasure. Good luck with everyone.